Fox News ran a headline. Harvard professor says all hell broke loose when his study found no racial bias in police shootings. The researcher Roland Fryer said in an interview that he required armed security after he published this finding. Now, I believe people are mad at him, but not because, as Fox would like us all to believe, this research doesn't match up with how they view the world and their preconceived notions, but people are mad because the research doesn't actually show there's no racial bias in police shootings. And I know this because to do this segment, I went places Fox News wouldn't dare go, a researcher's publications page. And I clicked the PDF link to the study, and I read Dr. Fryer's study in full. I, unfortunately, spent many of the young years of my life as a managing editor of an international research journal and in graduate school for data-driven policy at Brown University. So, I know enough about research and empirical evidence that relies on data and statistics, and I understand the methods used and the findings of the study. Fryer designed this study to assess one thing. Do police officers use lethal force more or less or the same across race? I don't think they found it's the same, which would mean there's no racial bias. But I also don't think they even designed the experiment in a way where they could assess a difference across race. We'll start with the obvious. The police departments self-report the data. Officers are unlikely to report on their own racist behavior. That's true in all research. Self-reporting is an unreliable data collection method. When you ask people to tell you, especially, about their bad behavior, they're unlikely to do so. But then there's also something called John Henry effects, which you may have heard of, where if participants in the study are aware they're in a study, they'll change their behavior. They know they're being monitored, so they'll probably use lethal force less, or in a less racist way. Another major flaw of the study is that they didn't factor into their finding the reality that police are choosing to interact with far more black people. They only compared behavior given an interaction is happening between a police officer and a suspect. Do the police use lethal force at the same rate when they're talking with white, black, or Hispanic people? Fryer acknowledged it was true in the study that police officers disproportionately stopped and frisked black people. The exact quote from Fryer himself was, "Black people are almost 4 times more likely to be stopped by the police relative to their population proportion." So, according to this study, if they're using lethal force at the same rate, when a black person walks out of the door in the morning, they're more likely to be shot at by police than a white person. And isn't that what people care about knowing? If all of those who are stopped by the police have lethal force used at the same rate, but if all the black people who pass police, more are stopped than among the white population, that's racial bias in police shootings. The fact that he wrote police officers were interacting with 4 times as many black people as their proportion of the population and still felt okay, saying, no, there's no racial bias in policing, is insane. I can't even begin to express how ridiculous framing the question like that is. If I was bartending and I went to my bar manager and I said, hey, I knocked some bottles off the shelf, they broke, it was an accident, man, and they said, okay, which ones? And I said, I broke Kettle One bottles and Burnett's bottles, very different price point, at the same rate. And they come out and they see like 40 Kettle One bottles and 2 Burnett's bottles broken. They'd be like, what the hell are you smoking, Burbank? And I say, well, conditional on bottles being stocked on the shelf, I broke 100%. So I broke both of those bottles at the same rate. They would be like, are you kidding me? That's not reality. It gets worse though, because somehow, in Fryer's 2016 study, if you read beyond just the headlines, it did not just look at lethal force. They also analyzed any use of force, and in the same exact study, he reported no racial bias in police shootings. He found that black people are 53% more likely to experience any use of force relative to the white average. That's significant. Now, people say it might be the case that black people are stopped more by the police because they commit more crimes. If cops over-police black neighborhoods and arrest everyone smoking weed or jaywalking or drinking, and they log in the system that those crimes happened, the data shows a higher crime rate. But if white people are smoking weed in a suburban area and jaywalking and being drunk in public and no one arrests them, was a crime committed? If a white guy's drunk and disorderly in the street but no one calls it in, was a crime committed? If a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, does it make a sound? If police aren't lingering in that neighborhood, the crime data won't reflect that those crimes happened. So if you make policing decisions on the history of crime data that exists, it will result in racial biases, because it's been the case since the beginning of policing that black people are targeted. This goes back really far, actually, because modern police come from slave patrol. Slave patrols are people who searched for the possession of weapons and potential runaway slaves and potential plots among existing slaves. It was a practice that continued until the end of the Civil War. And during Reconstruction, after the Civil War and passage of the 13th Amendment, slave patrols turned into militia-style groups enforcing what are known as the Black Codes, strict local and state laws that regulated and restricted access to labor, wages, voting rights, and denied access and general freedoms and equal rights to former slaves. Imagine the type of people signing up for this job to join these militias, okay? Imagine the culture and the practices in the workplace, if you can call a militia a workplace. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, and it essentially abolished the Black Codes, and then ushered in what we know as the Jim Crow era, laws that legalized segregation across racial lines. They spread immediately after its passage. Black Code militias were replaced by police departments to enforce local laws, including Jim Crow laws. Police oftentimes used excessive brutality with any African Americans who violated Jim Crow laws. The lineage there is important. The legacy of institutions matters. So, what I'm saying is to point to the data that exists and say black people throughout history do more crime, when the reality is that what was a crime for black people was not a crime for white people for the same exact behavior is dishonest and unjust. Vice actually found that black subjects shot by police were more likely to be shot during encounters that began with a traffic or pedestrian stop, which is especially interesting because Roland Fryer himself wrote that the data in his study are not nearly as representative as the data collected by the Post, The Guardian, or Vice. The Guardian found that although black males aged 15 to 34 make up just 2% of the population, they make up 15% of all killings in 2015, which is 5 times the number for whites. Using data collected on officer-involved shootings from 47 of the 50 largest police departments in the US, they found that 55% of shooting victims were black, which is more than double the share of the black population in those jurisdictions. While Fryer acknowledged this data was more robust than his, he didn't even discuss the details of those findings in his 2016 study, until he wrote a follow-up paper 3 years after his original publication in 2016. Now, Roland Fryer, if you watch him in media engagements and interviews, he comes off as like a really likable person, which is dangerous because the information he's conveying is dangerous. For him to say, my study makes people mad because the truth is hard, while he acknowledges his study's shortcomings and how his data isn't the only data within the academic community, it's a little bit ridiculous. The reason people were mad at him is because he made it seem like the data tell a story that they don't. There are consequences to this because legislators rely on research to make policy, which affects people every single day of their lives. The truth is not that people can't handle the truth, it's that the truth wasn't told by Fryer in the first place. Moreover, the truth is usually not written to be understood by most people. This is one of the major crises of American society. And this applies to Fryer, but also almost all research that gets published. The technical methods and weird jargon researchers use nearly always makes their work useless to the general public, journalists, and lawmakers. The fact that you need intense training to understand basic scientific observations about the world is kind of scary. It doesn't need to be like that. People deserve access to information, and using language that's just unknown to most people means you think only academics deserve to understand what you know and contribute to the world, which is just like not good. I just don't like that. So a big part of what I like to do is use my background and my data skills for good to translate this gibberish, because Fox News definitely won't do it.